We're going to talk today about the status of the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act currently right now, and just some updates about what the federal government is doing and saying about it. But I think it's extremely important. This is a map that is from Education Week. I think everybody's seeing it, everybody's sharing it. It's important to point out that at this point, 33 states have completely closed their schools through the end of this school year. An additional 4 states are closing at least through May, and the others are in different stages of considering when they might open. And so the reason we are talking about that and why it's grounding us is because it's an unprecedented number of students, including the 7.7 million students with disabilities who are impacted by this. And so everybody, I think, knows that those schools started closing around March 13th. And a little over 2 weeks later, a week and a half later, the Congress and President passed into law the CARES Act. That passed on March 27th. It included a $30 billion education stabilization fund. That money is going out to the states now. Megan's going to talk a little bit about that. It also included a directive. So Congress directed the Secretary of Education to examine the law and report back to Congress to talk about, basically within 30 days, with any recommendations about whether to waive provisions of federal education law during this pandemic. When we say waive, what that means is not enforce, not apply, make null and void during this particular period of time. And so that is something we've been watching and waiting. And on this Monday, April 27th, the department issued its waiver report. And this is a direct quote from the press release that the department put out as it described its report. And I think it's important for everyone to see what the department said about the principles it used as it reviewed provisions of federal law and made determinations about whether any of the rights guaranteed by those provisions needed to be waived or put aside, not enforced during this time. So these are the principles. Clearly, health and safety of students, teachers, everyone, top priority. Learning must continue for all students. Decision-making must be based on what is best for students, not the system. Parents, and we've added the highlighting here, parents must be informed about the impact waivers will have on their children's education and consent to those changes. And services typically or historically provided in person must naturally occur differently. I think we all know that by now, definitely. So the waiver report discussed several different laws. Congress asked the Secretary to look at all of the laws you see on this slide. The Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, that is our nation's largest general education law, largest and most comprehensive, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that's what we're going to discuss today, the particular waivers from that, and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The Rehabilitation Act, you may know, those are your 504 plans, the section that applies to students with disabilities in school who are eligible for the Rehabilitation Act is commonly referred to as Section 504. So the key takeaway from the Department of Education is that there were no waivers of the key components of IDEA. What this means is that schools must continue during this time to provide all of the rights and services under all of the key components of IDEA. Some of those are child find. So that's the portion of IDEA that requires schools to find children in the community who have disabilities and serve them or go through a process to determine if they do have, if they are eligible under the law for services. Eligibility determination. And Megan is going to talk a little bit about the ways that that happens, but that is typically where the team comes together and determines, does the student meet the criteria under the law and thus is eligible. Free, appropriate public education. This is the provision of specialized supports, services, and accommodations to that student in these new circumstances. That remains intact. Least restrictive environment. That is, are they getting are students with disabilities receiving an education in the least restrictive environment? We commonly talk about that in terms of, are they being included with their gen ed peers? In this time of social distancing, everyone is receiving education at home, or those everyone should be, I suppose, outside of other factors that might be prohibiting it. And so thus, is it offered in that same way as it's being offered to students in general education? And the individual education program, IEPs, do those remain intact? Yes. So there were no waivers recommended by the Secretary to Congress of any of these key components. I thought it was important to quote the department again, because we wanted to include information for you about how the Secretary of Education is viewing this and what she's saying about it. And so in her report to Congress, she stated, it is stated that our US Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, reaffirmed her long-held position that individualized education must take place for all students, including students with disabilities. As a result, the Secretary is not recommending Congress pass any additional waiver authority concerning FAPE, least restrictive environment, of IDEA, and reiterating that learning must continue for all students. So to just describe legally how this works for a second, the Secretary does not have legal authority to waive portions of law. So that's why Congress asked for her to report, examine these laws, recommend what you think might need to be waived, and then report back to Congress. It's important because Congress has the ultimate authority to change the law. Congress has the lawmaking powers under our Constitution, and therefore, if the law was to be changed, it would be Congress who would do that. And so I'm going to pass this to Megan to talk about now those waivers that the Secretary has recommended to Congress. So Megan.
Thanks, Lindsay. So the Secretary focused her recommendations specifically on young students who are transitioning from what we call Part C services to Part B services under IDEA. Under current law, right now, as children approach their 3rd birthday, the way that the process works is that they undergo another initial evaluation to assess where they are and what kinds of services they might need under Part B of IDEA, which serves children who are ages 3 through 21. And so along those lines, there are certain timelines in place to make sure that those evaluations happen. There is a requirement that the evaluation occur within a 60-day window once parents consent to it. And there's also a requirement that a school and family conference, oh, one second, Lindsay, can you go back? That a family and school conference take place 90 days before that transition to those preschool services under Part B actually begin. And so what the Secretary is recommending is let's not let children fall through the cracks if they are undergoing this transition from Part C to Part B. She really wants to ensure that those timelines are not holding up the process. We understand that it may be difficult during this time to provide services in person or to do the appropriate evaluations, which often need to be done face-to-face between children and practitioners. And so in this instance, the language that surrounds this recommendation really says, continue to serve these children under the Part C services that they've been receiving. And when it's appropriate to do so, do those initial evaluations in person later, but don't let these children stop receiving services altogether just because of these time constraints. So again, as Lindsay said, that is the recommendation. What will happen now is that Congress will have to make a decision. There's kind of 3 options for them. They may say, we agree with these and we are going to include this type of language in our next bill that we pass related to COVID. They may say, we disagree and pass no waivers, or they may say, we disagree and we're going to pass additional waivers. And so that is really where the decision will be made. At this point, it's really important to know nothing has changed the law right now. Schools and LEAs and SEAs will still be operating under IDEA, which is the law. The Secretary has issued guidance, and if you're curious about what her guidance has said, there is a separate webinar on the ELA website that you can see has been archived, where we talk in depth about what that guidance says and how schools should actually be implementing the law. But until Congress acts, nothing about the law has changed or the obligations and rights under that law. Next slide, Lindsay. And so just to give you an update, as schools are continuing to serve students and uphold those different obligations and figure out how to make all of this work, there are different sources of funding that have become available. As Lindsay mentioned, the CARES Act provided a lot of funding to states and to the department to help support schools during this time. So $13.5 billion has been released or is available to state education agencies. That 90% of that money will flow down to districts, and it can go to really support anything that helps them plan for school closures and distance learning. So that money will be going under kind of a Title I formula to the schools that are most in need. And so states have begun applying for that money, and the department has promised a 3-day turnaround to actually release that money and approve those applications. Then there's an additional $3 billion that has been made available to governors. That money can be used however the governor chooses, related to either K-12 or higher education, and it's meant to support those institutions or those schools hit hardest by the coronavirus. And so again, that money has already been made available, and schools are states and districts are beginning to receive these funds. And then just this week, the Department of Education also announced a competitive grant program for states. So some states can apply and may receive money, and the grants are focused around rethinking K-12 education and rethinking workforce preparation grants for educators. And this money, we're still kind of getting a better sense of what these programs might look like, but these are optional. So some states may look into applying for these grants. We have yet to see the proposals of how states would use that money, but you can keep an eye out to see whether your state has applied and whether any of that funding might be coming through to your district. And so looking ahead, as I just mentioned, states have been submitting their applications, and so we'll begin receiving the education funding through the CARES Act and those grant programs. And what we're expecting in terms of legislation, Congress has currently not in Washington, D.C., functioning the way they typically do, just because cases are increasing in Washington, D.C. right now. And so they have yet to determine the date at which the House will come back into session. But they're aiming for another bill to address COVID towards the end of May or early June. We expect that bill could address the waiver issue, where Congress will, engage in negotiations and decide where they want to land on whether to grant waivers and, to what extent. And we also expect that Congress will provide additional funding for education. And there are many groups advocating for different funding amounts for different kinds of programs, including IDEA. So we will have another update for you all in the coming weeks as we see how those negotiations go. And in the meantime, as I said, there are resources from the Department of Education on how to continue providing services to students under IDEA, how to be working with parents during this time. Many states have also issued guidance that includes specific policies that maybe are different, but still in line with what the Department of Education is recommending. And so it's really important that you also look to what your state education agency has put out on this. There may be specific policies your school or district should be following. So be sure to look at your state's website. And then there are other organizations outside of Educating All Learners Alliance. NCLD has also created resources on how to continue providing FAPE and working with families, because IDEA is still the law that is in effect, unchanged at this moment. And so now we can open it up to questions. I don't know, Gabby, if anyone has put them in the chat box, but we've saved some time for questions.
Sure, there aren't any questions right now in the chat, but we'll leave some time right now if anyone wants to think of any. You are, again, welcome to type them in. Here is one. How is proportionate share affected?
So I'll take a stab at this one. So proportionate share. So right now, proportionate share is unchanged, as Megan said. In that, just for those who aren't familiar with it, proportionate share is the amount of funding that comes under IDEA to school districts that they need to provide to private schools that are located within their district boundaries. They have great discretion over how they provide the services or how they use that money to provide services to students who are enrolled in private schools who have disabilities in their district. But they're in private schools. So it would be functioning right now in the exact same way that it did previously. The heads of those private schools work with the school district to determine how best to use the monies that are appropriated to provide services to the students in those schools.
Great, thank you for that one. Another person is asking, let's see, they said, I'm unsure if this is meant to say resource. They said, what recourse do families have if they've been told their child services are being suspended during this crisis? Mostly related services.
Yeah. So if families have been told, so the first thing you need to do is work with families do need to work with their school districts. And the school districts that are still operating under IDEA, so they are still required to provide services. Although we know that it's extremely hard to provide services in a one-on-one environment, it may take some time for schools to put into place the types of technology and procedures that are needed for those. So the best thing a family can do at this point is to reach out to their case manager or their special ed director, the person that they have typically, maybe the principal of the school, the person that they've typically interacted with on their child's IEP team, and discuss what's the plan for getting those services in place. What can the family be expecting? I don't know, Megan, if you'd add anything to that.
No, I think that's right. I think many schools are still figuring out how to provide services. And so I think it's important to collaborate and figure out a solution that works for both the families and the schools, and that collaboration is key.
And there's kind of a similar question related to students receiving services, and that someone is asking, parents are finding their children are receiving far less or shorter services. For example, a child was receiving 2 45-minute sessions and is now receiving 1 15-minute session. How should parents respond to that?
So I would say, I think every parent of every student across the nation has found a real structural change to the way their children are being educated right now. I think that schools are not providing services for the same amount of time during the school day for any student. And again, I think the best thing to do is to work with the school to determine how are they making the decisions about how much time to be providing that education? What is the plan going forward for whether they'll increase that? And I think it really is about making sure that they know what you're observing at home as a parent, how your child is responding to that. But I think the evidence that we're seeing from across the nation is that most public schools that are providing services to students are doing so for all students in shorter amounts of time across the school day.
Absolutely. There's quite a few questions being added, so I'll go through as much as I can. So this other person was asking a bit more, I believe, from the first question, in that they want to know, is there more discussion around who will pay for the extended services in Part C, pot of money, Part B, pot of money?
So that is a question that's being discussed right now. My understanding is that in some states, they're working out an arrangement between the Part B and Part C and Part B funding, and they've come to some agreements, and other places it's still up in the air as to who is responsible. In her report, the secretary actually said that the CARES Act funding should support the continuation of Part C services. So right now there's not kind of a uniform system for how to do it, but we are seeing some states working that out on their own. But I think that it'll vary state by state until or unless Congress issues more clear directive or the secretary issues guidance on it.
Mm-hmm. And have any flexibilities unrelated to waivers been granted related to maintenance of effort requirements and use of Title I monies for districts?
My understanding is that not yet. I don't believe the secretary has asked for that ability for local waivers of maintenance of efforts. But I'm not as sure about ESSA and Title I. I can get back to the question asker about that.
Sure. And if they did want to get in contact with you to maybe follow up, do you have maybe your email on a slide that we can show to people?
They can email policy@ncld.org, and I could put that in the chat.
There we go. Perfect. Awesome. So another person is asking your thoughts on how some parents are being told to waive rights to comp ed.
We did see, unfortunately, I think it was in the state of New Jersey, school districts asking parents to waive rights in order to receive services. There's no precedent for that legally. I think parents need to think carefully about that. We're not going to be providing legal advice necessarily on this webinar, but that is not something that would be required under IDEA. And I think it's important to just note that right now, IDEA remains intact and schools do need to be following it.
And then one more question that we see in the chat here is someone is asking if you could talk a bit more about compensatory services after the pandemic.
So compensatory services are typically provided when parents or others have exercised their rights and under IDEA. So it's a framework that's used, it's a legal remedy basically that's used once a parent has filed a due process claim against a district, and then a court of law has determined that the district has violated IDEA, and what their violation meant was that a student didn't receive the services that they were due for some period of time. And compensatory services means the district agrees that going forward, they will provide extra services to make up for the lost time. Here, we're in a little bit different situation because none of our students, as an earlier question referred to, are receiving education for the same amount of time that they would be if they were walking into their school building. So I think we're going to have to really carefully look at this going forward. And frankly, as a nation, we'll have to address for all of our students the massive learning loss that we're likely to see when children return back to school, if that happens in a normal way. We're going to have to be judging what has happened across every different child's experience while they've been in this new environment of distance learning. So the compensatory services framework is one that the department referred to in the first set of guidance it issued immediately after the pandemic. Schools began to close down, and it's not clear to us whether that will be a framework that's used. What is clear is that we need funding to ensure that our schools can provide the supports they're going to need to help every student, including those with disabilities, receive more education and more opportunity to learn as they return to school.
Absolutely. And as we sort of wrap up, there is one more final question, a bit more specific, but can relate as this becomes more common for others. So someone is mentioning a specific example of a state, Michigan, where current guidance has mention of creation of general continuity of learning plans for distant learnings, and strongly encourages districts to develop those for students with IEPs. But the Michigan guidance also states that parents do not have to be involved in the development of those. And so is there a good way for parents to state they don't want to waive their rights under IDEA if given a plan from their schools, which they don't either participate in creating or don't agree with all aspects of? And while I go ahead and let you answer, I'm also going to go ahead and post up a poll for all the participants if you would be willing to give us your feedback.
And I can comment on this one quickly. I think lots of districts are turning to these contingency learning plans, and I think they can be a good way to acknowledge that this is a very different time and they need to make adjustments and provide different kinds of supports to students who are learning from home. I think what I've heard some parents are doing is just not signing the plan. There's no necessarily requirement that parents agree to all of it, but it is kind of a declaration of what the school is able to provide right now. I think it is important that if there is a contingency learning plan, the IEP remain intact so that that is still the legal document outlining what the student is entitled to that parents can use in their discussions and planning going forward.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating. Again, if you had any follow-up questions, there was that email included in the chat, policy@ncld.org. And you're welcome to refer to the recording of this webinar, as well as other ELO webinars on educatingalllearners.org. And there you'll find both recordings as well as slideshows and resources for similar information. Great, well, thank you all, and thank you again, NCLD team. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.